So most of us know this by now, but the iPhone 11 Pro is by far one of my most favorite iPhones of all time. It's probably one of the best iPhones of all time as well. This iPhone was one that I used which came out in 2019. I used it for about a year until the iPhone 12 Pro came out and I switched over to that. And this was probably one of my most favorite phones I've ever used in general. It was a beautiful device, and even now in 2023, I think this phone holds up excellently as well. Now I'll talk about my opinion on this phone this day and age, but if you want to pick up some phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of this phone, as some of you may know, this device kind of stemmed from the iPhone 10, 10s type of design. It was the direct successor of the iPhone 10s. And what was so crazy about this phone was that visually it was a pretty big difference. On the front though, this was probably the least amount of difference if I'm being honest. You had a 5.8 inch Super Retina XDR OLED panel on this. It was 1125 by 2436. It was a 60 hertz panel, so it wasn't like a crazy high resolution, crazy high refresh rate or anything like that. But this was still a phone where I looked at this specific device and it had a really good display. I feel like the iPhone 10 and 10s still have a very good display as well, but this one looked excellent, and I'm still a humongous fan of how this specific display holds up. You have Face ID on the front. You have pretty much no bezel. You have a little bit of bezel around it, but it still looks very good. You have a curved side, so it's not a flat side on this iPhone. It was one of the last curved side, main flagship phones that we had until the iPhone 12s. And on the bottom, we have a lightning port, which still looks pretty good. On the back, we have the frosted glass back, which adds, as I mentioned, this was one of the bigger differences here. Going from that standard glass back to that frosted glass back was a big difference. When I first picked this phone up, I honestly didn't know how to feel about it. I was kind of indifferent. I thought it felt a little weird, but once I got used to it, I started to see how much better this type of back feels on a phone, rather than the actual, standard glass back that we had on the previous generation. And still to this day with the iPhone 14 Pros, this is still a flagship feature. With the iPhone 14, it's that standard glass back. But with the iPhone, 14 Pro, that's that frosted glass back, and this iPhone also shares that, ever since the Pro model was made, this was the option we had. This was also the first Pro iPhone, if you really consider it. Before this, we had the Plus versions, and I think the Pro moniker actually set up very, very well, and this was the first, Pro iPhone that we actually had there. Now this phone still had, wireless charging, still had IP certification, very, very good build quality, and overall, I'll definitely tell you, it was a very, very good feeling phone, very good performing phone, and overall, I think it was still a phone where I look at it, and I still think it holds up very, very well to this day. Now, in terms of the camera setup, this is also one thing that's very interesting about this phone. It was the first set of iPhones that had that triple camera setup. So it had that 12 megapixel wide angle lens, 12 megapixel telephoto lens, and then a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. And on the front, it had a 12 megapixel wide angle lens. Now with this type of camera, very, very interesting setup. This was the first iPhone to bring both 4K at 60 on the front and the back. Before this, we had 1080p at 60 on the front. So the fact that Apple went ahead and, rearranged it this time around was really cool. And I'm a massive fan of that specific situation as well. Now, on top of that, this phone's, camera performance is very, very good. Having that ability of zooming in and zooming out, that much is awesome. And even though nowadays we have a little bit more capability with the cameras, having that triple camera, setup is future-proofing this phone enough, in my opinion. Now, on top of that, with this type of, device, I think that, this phone looks very good still. I think this phone takes really good photos and videos. And with applications, I've said this before, with like Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok, those apps are very, very optimized for these types of phones. And honestly, for this type of device, you're going to be getting a very good camera still. When compared to the iPhone 14, obviously those cameras are going to be better. They're going to be giving you just better performance overall. But I still think this thing still has a lot of capability built in. You still have things like portrait mode. You still have the 4K at 60 on the front and the back. You are missing things like cinematic mode and like stabilization mode. But I think this is still a pretty good camera when it comes down to it. So in terms of that, thumbs up for me for sure. Now in the software and the longevity portion, and this is the one area too where it can be a little bit interesting. So with the iPhone 11 Pro, this phone came out in 2019. I am pretty sure this phone is going to be lasting for a much longer period of time than, just this year. So you're going to be fine this year. You're going to be fine next year. This phone is pretty much the third in line to be dropped. So Apple still needs to go and drop the iPhone 10, iPhone 10s, and then they'll touch the iPhone 11 Pros. So, we still have a long period of time. I think probably at the very minimum, probably 3 years till this phone sees any sort of like rumors that it's going to be discontinued. So, probably 2025, 2026 is when we're going to start hearing those rumors. And hey, you still have those many years to actually use this phone and still get the latest and greatest updates. And I want to say that Apple has been doing a pretty good job at pretty much giving us all the features on the iOS versions on these types of devices. So that's kind of another big advantage here too. So when it comes down to it, that in and of itself is a really big asset for this device as well. Now, in the performance side, this iPhone has that Apple A13 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, with the iPhone 11 Pro, I think this is still a very, very good performing iPhone. From pretty much everything I've ever done with this device for the last several years, it's been able to handle everything I've thrown at it. And that means including, the day-to-day tasks that I did with this phone pretty much every single day. This was my main phone I was using. So anything I was doing at that moment, this is the phone I was using, and I had a great time with it. I think the performance of this phone is still very stable. And, from that aspect, from like when this phone came out with iOS 14 or 13, I had a great time with it. And even now it still is holding up very well. Now, also, when I went ahead and compared it to the iPhone 12s, 13s, and the iPhone 14s, and a ton of different Samsung and OnePlus and Google Pixel phones that have came out since then as well, I've been having very smooth, good performance with this device for sure. And that's something where I look at this phone, I'm just so happy about. Although this phone doesn't have things like the iPhone 14 Pro has, like the dynamic notch and the 120 Hz and a faster processor, this phone still feels like a very smooth phone. And I think Apple did a great job with that A13 chip. That's another big asset for this device. Even though it's not perfect, I think it still gets the job done, and it is a very, very good phone in that, specific situation. So if you're trying to play heavy intensive games or even just, minor tasks or whatever you're doing, you're going to be getting a very, very good performing phone from this thing. And again, it gets a thumbs up for me for sure. Now, another area where this phone just really just blew my socks off was with the battery life. Back in the day in 2019 when this phone came out, I was using my iPhone 10 that actually had a battery case with it. My iPhone 11 Pro, the battery life was so good, it was better than my iPhone 10 with the battery case inside of it. The iPhone 11 Pro has a 3046 mAh battery. It's not the biggest size battery of all time, but it is a very good size battery to have on a phone like this. Since then, the batteries have degraded, for at least my model. And, it's definitely not, the battery that it used to be, especially on iOS 16. But I, for one, think that this iPhone 11 Pro's battery life is still pretty good. And I think, can be a pretty big asset for this phone as well. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I will definitely tell you is I think the iPhone 11 Pro is a clear, 100% recommendation from me. I think it is a very good phone that Apple made, and I still think to this day it holds up very, very well. It may not be like the first phone I would recommend people, but if you don't have the money to go and buy an iPhone 14 Pro, or if you're using a very, very old phone like an iPhone 6 to iPhone 7, getting an iPhone 11 Pro in the used market can honestly be a really, really smart decision. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.